They found him at his desk, pen in hand, frozen exactly as he had sat 13 years before. The cabin was dim when they pushed the door open. The wood had swollen and warped in the cold, and it gave way with a sound like a held breath released all at once. The man inside did not look up. He sat very still in the chair that had become, over the slow passage of a decade and more, a kind of throne of ice and permanence. His coat was in good order. His hat rested on the table beside him. In his right hand, the quill. On the page before him, the last entry in a log that the Arctic had sealed like a letter no one was ever meant to read. The date on that final page was November 11th, 1762. The men who found him did not speak for a long time. There was nothing that felt appropriate to say. The ship around them, the Octavius, was whole. Her hull had not been pierced. Her masts still stood in some approximation of readiness, as though she were waiting for a wind that had simply been delayed. And yet everything aboard her was frozen solid. The cargo, the rigging, the bodies of the crew in their bunks, the woman and the child in a cabin below, the fire in the fireplace that had simply stopped mid-burn and never resumed. Outside, the waters of the Arctic were the colour of pewter. The year was 1775. 13 years had passed since the Octavius had last been seen by anyone who could report on her. And now she was here, drifting east of Greenland without a living soul aboard, her dead arranged in attitudes of sleep, of work, of ordinary waiting, as though the world had simply paused around them one ordinary evening and never resumed its turning. Close your eyes now if you like. Let the cold of that story settle over you gently, the way frost settles, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until everything it touches is still. This is the story of the Octavius. You are somewhere comfortable, perhaps already lying down. Perhaps the light is low, or the room is quiet, or there is the distant sound of something ordinary. Rain on a window, the hum of a house settling into its evening. You are here, and the world outside is doing whatever it does, and none of that reaches you now. Let the weight of your body settle. There is no need to hold yourself up against anything. The night or the hour, whatever it is, belongs to you and to the story that is coming. The story of the Octavius is one of those rare tales that exists somewhere between history and legend, between the verifiable and the half-dreamed. It is a story of ice and endurance, of a ship that sailed into the unknown and was swallowed by it, of a captain who kept writing until there was nothing left to write about, and of the long, patient mystery that followed. It is a story that has fascinated sailors and historians and dreamers for centuries, and it is a story that belongs very much to the world of the deep cold, to the Arctic, to the Northwest Passage, to that particular quality of silence that exists only where the ice is absolute. If you enjoy listening to stories like this one, stories of mystery and history and the slow, patient unfolding of the past, please consider subscribing to the channel. New stories like this one arrive every week, and there is always another world waiting to be entered. Tonight we are going north. We are going to the place where the sea freezes and the stars do not set in summer, and the darkness of winter is so complete that men who spent time there sometimes spoke of it afterward in lowered voices, as though the memory itself required a kind of reverence. We're going to the 18th century, to the age of sail, to the decades when the great maritime powers of Europe were still trying to find a route through the Arctic waters north of the American continent, a passage that would, if it existed, cut the trading distance between the Atlantic and the Pacific by thousands of miles. We're going to the world that made the Octavius possible, and then to the ship herself, and then to the long silence that followed her disappearance, and then to the morning in 1775 when a whaling vessel called the Herald encountered something in the waters east of Greenland that none of her crew would ever quite be able to explain. But first let us go back further still. Let us go to the beginning, to the idea that sent ships like the Octavius northward in the first place. Let us go to the dream of the Northwest Passage and to the world that believed in it with the kind of faith that moves men across oceans toward places that have no name yet on any chart. Settle now, let your breathing slow, the story will come to you gently, the way cold air comes, around the edges first, and then, before you notice, everywhere. There is a particular quality to the dreams that send men into dangerous places. They are not, in the ordinary sense, reckless. They are, if anything, too reasonable. too carefully constructed on maps and calculations and the testimony of those who have been partway there and come back with stories of openings in the ice, of channels that widen to the west, of currents running in the right direction. The dream of the Northwest Passage was exactly this kind of dream. It was a dream built on logic and sustained by hope, and it sent ships north for 4 centuries before anyone was quite sure whether the thing they were looking for existed at all. The idea is simple enough to state. The continents of North and South America form a barrier between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. To get from one ocean to the other by sea, in the age before the Panama Canal, you had to sail around the southern tip of South America, a journey of extraordinary length and notorious danger through the waters of Cape Horn, where the Southern Ocean produces waves of a kind that even experienced sailors described with a careful, specific dread. It could add months to a trading voyage. It added cost and risk in proportions that made merchants and admiralties alike want very much to believe there was another way. The other way was the Northwest Passage. If you could sail north from the Atlantic, enter the Arctic waters above Canada, find a channel through the ice and the islands, and emerge on the other side into the Pacific, the trading route to Asia would be transformed. The spice trades, the silk trades, the entire complex web of commerce that connected Europe to the east would become shorter, cheaper, safer. The nation that found such a route would hold a commercial advantage of incalculable value. This is what made the search for the Northwest Passage not merely a question of exploration, but a matter of national interest. And in the 18th century, national interest in maritime matters was taken with great seriousness. The maritime powers, Britain above all, but also France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, understood that their wealth and their power depended on the sea, and that the sea rewarded those who knew it best. To find the Northwest Passage would be to know something the others did not. It would be to hold a key that no one else had cut. The first serious attempts to find this passage began in the early 16th century, not long after the European discovery of the Americas made the problem concrete. John Cabot sailed north from England in 1497. Martin Frobisher made 3 voyages to the Arctic in the 1570s. Henry Hudson, whose name now belongs to the great bay in northern Canada that claimed him, pushed deep into the Arctic waters in 1610 before his mutinous crew set him adrift in a small boat and he was never seen again. Each of these men found something. None of them found the passage, but each one came back with reports that sustained the dream, of channels that seemed to lead somewhere, of open water glimpsed beyond a barrier of ice, of Inuit peoples who spoke of routes to the west. The dream fed on these fragments. It was very patient. By the 18th century, the search had acquired a kind of institutional momentum. The British Admiralty funded expeditions. Prizes were offered for anyone who could find the passage or even reach certain degrees of northern latitude. The culture of exploration had become, in some ways, its own form of industry, producing ships, crews, charts, journals, and occasional disasters with the regularity of any other enterprise. It was into this culture that the Octavius sailed. She was a merchant vessel, not an exploration ship, not commissioned by any admiralty or fitted out with the special equipment that the dedicated Arctic expeditions carried. She was simply a ship engaged in trade, with a captain who believed, or who had been persuaded to believe, that the Northwest Passage was not only real, but navigable, and that a ship that found it first would return home wealthy beyond the usual calculations of profit. What sort of man takes a merchant vessel into Arctic waters on the basis of that belief? The question is not as simple as it sounds. It is easy, from the comfortable distance of the present, to call such a decision reckless. But in the world of 18th century commerce and exploration, the line between boldness and recklessness was genuinely unclear. The known routes were well-travelled, and well-travelled routes were crowded routes. The captains and merchants who prospered were often those willing to try something others had not tried. The Northwest Passage, if it could be found, was exactly the kind of advantage that transformed a comfortable business into a magnificent one. And so the Octavius went north. She went north in 1761, setting out from England in the spring with a cargo bound for China, and a captain whose name has not been preserved with complete certainty in the historical record. She reached the Pacific by the conventional southern route, completed her trading mission, and then, rather than sailing home the way she had come, she turned north. She turned north because her captain had decided, or been convinced, or simply hoped, that the passage was there and that this was the season to find it, and that the cargo she carried would be worth a great deal more if it arrived home by the shorter, faster route. The decision was made somewhere in the Pacific, in waters warm enough to forget for a moment the cold that was coming. It was made, presumably, with maps spread out on the captain's table, with the calculations of currents and ice seasons reviewed once more, with the confidence that exists before a thing has gone wrong. It was made, and then the ship turned north and the cold began. There is a particular quality to the Arctic cold. It is not simply a lower temperature, it is a presence, a density to the air, a weight to the silence, a quality of light that belongs to no other place on Earth. Sailors who had been there described it in terms that were almost reverent, even when the experience had been terrible. The ice itself had a kind of beauty that men could not help noticing, even as they feared it. The colours of it, the blue-green depths, the way it caught the low Arctic sun and threw back light in angles that seemed to belong to some physics the rest of the world did not operate under. The Octavius sailed into that world in the summer of 1761, when the ice was at its most retreated and the days were longest. At such a time, in such conditions, the passage might have seemed genuinely possible. The channels between the islands of the Canadian Arctic archipelago could open wide enough in the right summer to admit a ship. The ice did not always close everything off. There were seasons when men looked at the water and believed. We do not know what the captain believed in those first weeks. We do not have his log from the outward journey if he kept one. What we have, or what the story gives us, is the image of a ship moving through increasingly cold water, with increasingly heavy ice on either side, with the northern latitude climbing on the navigation charts, and the season moving, as seasons do without regard for human plans, toward autumn. Autumn in the Arctic is not the slow, golden thing it is in gentler latitudes. It arrives with speed and with decision. The temperatures drop. The ice that retreated in summer advances again, and it advances fast. A channel that was open in August can be closed by September, and closed not by a thin layer that might be broken by a determined hull, but by ice of a thickness and solidity that stops ships entirely. The Octavius, somewhere in the channels of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, met the autumn, and the autumn stopped her. Let that image rest in you now as you breathe slowly in the warmth of wherever you are. A ship, ice around her, closing like a hand, the sound of it, a low, continuous creaking, a groaning of wood against pressure that does not relent, the cold coming down from the sky and up from the water until there is no direction that does not bring more cold. The ship stopped, and the long wait began. Before we follow the Octavius into the ice, let us spend a little time with the world she carried within her. A ship of the 18th century was a small and intricate civilization. It had its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own rhythms of work and rest and eating. It had its smells, tar and salt and rope and the particular human warmth of men living close together, and its sounds, which were never entirely silent, because a wooden ship in water is always speaking in the language of stress and tension, and the slow working of wood against itself. A merchant vessel of the Octavius's type and period would have carried a crew of perhaps 20 to 30 men, depending on her size and her cargo. The captain occupied the largest private cabin, at the stern, the quietest and most stable part of the ship, where the motion of the sea was gentlest and the authority of command could be sustained by the simple fact of physical separation from the men. Below the captain in rank came the first mate, who ran the practical business of the ship's operation, and the second mate, and so on down through a hierarchy that was as clear and as unquestioned as anything the age produced. Below the officers came the ordinary sailors, who lived forward, in the cramped space of the forecastle, in bunks arranged in tiers so that a man sleeping in the upper bunk had perhaps 18 inches of clearance above his face. The forecastle smelled of everything that accumulated in a small space occupied by working men who could not easily wash. Sweat and damp wool and the oil they used on their hands and the tobacco they smoked in their off-hours. It was not comfortable by any standard the modern world would recognize, but it was theirs, and men who spent months at sea developed a particular attachment to the small territories they occupied in it. The work of a ship is constant. There is no day off at sea. The watches rotate, 4 hours on, 4 hours off around the clock, so that the ship is always crewed, always attended, always responsive to whatever the sea and the wind require. In good weather, the work was manageable, and even, in its repetitive way, pleasant. The rigging had to be maintained, the sails had to be managed, the decks had to be kept clear and safe, the navigation had to be checked and rechecked. In bad weather, the same tasks became ordeals of cold and exhaustion and fear. Food on a merchant vessel of this period was functional rather than pleasurable. The staples were salt meat, beef or pork, packed in barrels of brine, and hard biscuit. The dense unleavened bread that kept indefinitely without refrigeration, but required a careful approach if a man wished to avoid breaking a tooth. There were dried peas, and sometimes dried fish, and whatever fresh provisions the ship had taken on at her last port of call. In the early days of a voyage there might be fresh vegetables. As the weeks passed, these disappeared, and with them the vitamins that the human body requires in quantities that the standard ship's diet did not provide. Scurvy was the shadow that followed every long voyage. It arrived slowly, first as a fatigue that rest did not entirely relieve, then as a soreness in the joints, then as a decay of the gums, a reopening of old wounds, a collapse of the connective tissue that held the body together. By the 1760s, the connection between scurvy and fresh food was understood in rough terms by most experienced sailors, and many ships carried lemon or lime juice as a preventive. But understanding something in rough terms and applying it consistently were different matters, especially in the midst of a voyage that had already gone differently than planned. The Octavius, when she turned north toward the Arctic, had been at sea for months. Her fresh provisions were long gone. Her crew was managing on the preserved stores that had lasted through the Pacific crossing and the trading mission in China. They were not, at this point, physically fresh. They were the men that a long voyage produces, competent, accustomed, but carrying the accumulated fatigue of months away from land. Among the crew, there were also passengers. The story of the Octavius includes, in its most evocative versions, the mention of a woman and a child, a passenger of some kind travelling with a young son or daughter. This detail is one of the most haunting elements of the legend, and one of the most human. A woman on a merchant vessel in the 18th century was not impossible, but it was not common. She would have been there because she had reason to be, a wife following a husband to a posting, or a woman with business of her own that required the passage. We do not know her name. We do not know the child's name either. We know only what was reported by the men who found them, years later, in a cabin below decks, wrapped in what appeared to be attempts at warmth, a fire lit nearby, blankets arranged with care, the particular posture of a mother trying to shield a child against cold that could not be kept out. There is something in that image that asked to be held quietly. A woman who knew the cold was winning and still arranged blankets, a mother in the Arctic darkness still trying. Let us stay with that for a moment before we continue. Let the stillness of it settle. There is no need to hurry past. Some things deserve to be simply noticed, without commentary. The captain, too, is a presence we can only partially reconstruct. His name appears in various accounts as something like Harrison, though the records are not consistent enough to be certain. What we can say is that he was the kind of man who commanded a ship, who was trusted with a vessel and a cargo and the lives of his crew, who had the knowledge and the temperament that the age required for such a role. He was not a young man making his first voyage. He was someone who had been to sea before, who understood the rhythms of it, who had faced bad weather and difficult decisions and come through them. The decision to attempt the Northwest Passage was his. Whatever mix of ambition and calculation and simple hope went into that decision, it was made by a man who believed he could handle what came next. He was the kind of man who believed in his own capacity to manage, which is both the essential quality of leadership and the specific weakness that the unexpected exploits. He sat at his desk in the stern cabin and made his calculations and entered his observations in his log. The log was where the captain kept the official record of the voyage: positions, weather, events, decisions. It was a legal document as much as a personal one, meant to be read by owners and insurers and, in cases of disaster, by courts of inquiry. And yet it was also inevitably a kind of portrait. The entries, even in their official language, revealed the man, his attention, his preoccupations, his way of seeing the ship and the sea. We know that he kept writing. We know that because the log was still in his hand when the ship was found. We know that the last entry was dated, and that the date was November 11th, 1762, and that by that date the ship had been trapped in the ice for some months, and that the cold had become something that could not be managed or mitigated or solved by any adjustment of blankets or fuel. What we do not know is what those last pages said. The log, if it was recovered, has not been preserved in any form that scholars have verified. What survives is the account given by the sailors who found it, the general impression of entries, the final date, the image of a captain sitting with pen in hand as though he had simply paused between one sentence and the next. Perhaps he had. Perhaps the cold took him between one thought and the next, quietly, in the middle of a word. There are worse ways to go, and the Arctic, for all its violence, has sometimes been said to offer a certain gentleness in the end, a numbness that replaces pain, a drowsiness that replaces fear. But we are not there yet. We are still in the earlier part of the story. The ship is in the ice, but the cold has not yet won. The crew is still alive, still trying. The fire is still burning in its way against the dark. Rest now. Let the image of the ship settle around you. The wood, the cold, the faint glow of lamplight through a porthole. You are not aboard her. You are here, warm and safe, with the whole world of the past spread out before you like a map of somewhere you're visiting only in your imagination. The story continues when you are ready. It is patient. It has been waiting a long time. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Now back to the ice, and to the Octavius, and to the slow story of what happened next. The Arctic in winter is a place that rewrites the human understanding of time. In the world the Octavius's crew had come from, England, or wherever each man had originated before the sea took him, time was structured by light. The day began when the sun rose and ended when it set, and even in the depths of winter, when the days were short and the darkness came early, there was still a rhythm, still a reliable alternation of brightness and dark that organised the hours and gave the body its cues about when to wake and when to sleep. In the Arctic winter, this rhythm disappears. Above the Arctic Circle, in the depths of the cold season, the sun does not rise at all. There are days, weeks, months of continuous darkness, broken only by the faint auroral light of the stars and, on the clearest nights, the extraordinary display of the northern lights, which pulse across the sky in colours that seem to belong to some other spectrum than the one the human eye normally occupies. Green and purple, and sometimes red, they move across the darkness in curtains and arcs, soundless and indifferent and beautiful in a way that men who saw them for the first time sometimes struggled to describe afterward. The darkness does things to the human mind that even experienced polar travellers found difficult to prepare for. It disrupts sleep, but not in the way that too much light disrupts it. It disrupts it by removing the signals that tell the body when sleep is appropriate. Without the sun's movement to pace the day, time becomes elastic. Hours stretch or compress without warning. Men who had spent years at sea, calibrated to the watches and the bells and the reliable cycling of day and night, found themselves confused in the Arctic darkness, unsure how long they had slept or how long they had been awake. The cold compounded this. Arctic cold is not simply a lower temperature. It is a density of air that changes how everything feels and moves. The breath becomes visible, and then, in extreme cold, it freezes before it dissipates. Tiny crystals of ice forming in the exhaled air, falling silently toward a deck that is itself covered in ice. The ropes freeze into the rigidity of iron bars. The sails, if they are not furled and stored below decks, freeze into shapes that bear no relation to the practical curves they need to maintain in order to catch wind. Metal becomes a hazard. Touching it with bare skin, even briefly, can result in flesh adhering to the surface as though welded there. The Octavius, trapped in the ice of the Canadian Arctic archipelago in the autumn of 1761, was confronting all of this. She was a wooden ship built for the trades, not for Arctic conditions. Her hull was not reinforced in the way that the purpose-built exploration vessels were reinforced, with doubled planking and internal bracing designed to resist the pressure of ice. She was, in this respect, vulnerable to something that the ice would very much like to do to any ship caught within its grip. Ice does not simply surround a trapped ship, it pressures her. As the freeze deepens and spreads, the ice contracts and expands in response to temperature changes, and these movements transmit force to anything enclosed within the ice field. A ship in pack ice can be subjected to pressure from all sides simultaneously, squeezed, tilted, lifted, and in the worst cases crushed, her hull staved in and her seams opened and the water rushing in before anyone can respond. The Octavius did not sink. This is one of the most remarkable facts of her story. She was held in the ice, pressured by it, confined within it for years, and yet her hull remained intact. Either she was fortunate in the configuration of the ice around her, which distributed its pressure in ways that did not concentrate force on her most vulnerable points, or she was better built than the circumstances might suggest, or both. We do not know. We know only that she did not go down. The crew, meanwhile, was managing the cold as best they could. The ship's stove, which burned coal or wood, was their primary defence against the temperature. In ordinary conditions, a ship's stove kept the below-deck spaces warm enough for comfort. In Arctic conditions, it kept them from freezing, at the cost of a constant and anxious attention to fuel supplies. Coal was finite. Wood was finite. The interior wood of the ship herself could be burned only in the most extreme circumstances, because burning the ship's fabric meant reducing the structural integrity that kept the cold water out. The calculation of how much fuel remained and how long it needed to last was one of the most important and most quietly terrifying calculations that the captain had to make in those early weeks of the entrapment. Food supplies were similarly finite. The ship had been at sea for months before she turned north. Her stores were not those of a freshly provisioned vessel. The men ate, but they ate less well than they had in port, and as the weeks became months and the cold deepened, the question of whether the provisions would outlast the winter was one that sat at the back of every conversation, and sometimes, in the darkest part of the night watch, came forward into the full light of conscious fear. The winter of 1761 to 1762 was the first winter. We do not know from any surviving record what the specific conditions were in the channels where the Octavius was held. We know the general character of Arctic winters in the region, the temperatures, the darkness, the ice. We can reason from those general facts to some sense of what the crew was enduring, but the specific texture of those months, the conversations and the silences and the small acts of courage and despair that would have filled them, are lost. What we can say is that they survived the first winter. The ship was still whole in the spring, and some of the crew at least were still alive. We know this because the final log entry is dated November 1762, a year and more after the initial entrapment. The ship had been in the ice for over a year, and the captain was still writing. Think about what that means. A year in the ice, a year of darkness and cold and limited food, and the constant low-level pressure of confinement. A year of watching the summer come, the brief, bright Arctic summer, when the ice retreats a little, and the sun circles the sky without setting, and the seabirds return, and the world seems, for a few weeks, to have relented, and then watching the summer leave again, and the ice advance once more, and the darkness return. A year is a long time to keep writing in a log. It is a long time to maintain the habits of record and observation that the captain's role required. It speaks to something in the man, a determination, a professionalism, a perhaps desperate need to impose order on a situation that was steadily losing whatever order it had had. The micro-question that hangs in the air of any consideration of those months is this. What did he write about? What do you write about when the ship cannot move, and the ice holds, and the entries under the heading of course and distance are simply blanks? What do you record when the voyage has ceased to be a voyage and become something else entirely? A confinement, an ordeal, a waiting that has no certain end? Perhaps he wrote about the weather, which in the Arctic is never merely weather but something closer to a character with moods and intentions. Perhaps he wrote about the crew, their health, their spirits, their behaviour. Perhaps he wrote about the ice itself, which the men who have spent time with it often describe in almost personal terms, as though it has preferences and habits that can be learned. Perhaps he wrote about the woman and the child. Perhaps he wrote about the fire. We do not know. The log has not been found in any form that settles the question. What we have is the image of a man writing, in the cold, at his desk, with the pen moving across the page in the light of whatever remained of his lamp oil. It is an image of remarkable composure, and composure in circumstances like these is a form of courage that deserves acknowledgement. Let your breathing slow now. Let the darkness of that story settle around you gently, the way the Arctic darkness settles, not all at once but gradually, hour by hour, until it is simply the condition of the world. The second Arctic winter came the way all Arctic winters come, decisively, without negotiation. The brief summer of 1762 had passed. We do not know what happened during that summer, whether the ice around the Octavius had loosened enough to raise hopes of escape, whether the ship had shifted at all in the channels of the archipelago, whether the captain had made any attempt to work her free. We do not know whether the summer had been enough to partially replenish the food stores, whether the crew had managed to hunt the seals and the Arctic birds and the occasional polar bear that a resourceful crew in those waters might have attempted, or whether the supplies had simply continued to dwindle without supplement. What we know is that the second autumn found the ship still in the ice, and the second darkness came and the captain was still at his desk. November 11th, 1762. That is the date on the last entry in the log. It is a date in November, which in the Arctic means that the darkness has been fully established for some weeks, that the sun has not risen above the horizon in the period since perhaps late September, and that the temperatures have dropped to the level where the cold is no longer merely uncomfortable, but genuinely lethal to anyone unprotected. We can only imagine the state of the ship on that day. A year of Arctic winter, a brief summer, and now the second winter descending. The stores would have been diminished significantly, perhaps critically. The fuel for the stove would have been a constant anxiety. Coal carefully rationed, wood carefully preserved, the fire maintained at the minimum level needed to keep the temperature below decks above the point where the cold becomes immediately life-threatening. The crew would not all have survived to November of the second year. This is a reasonable inference from what we know of the conditions and what we know about human physiology in extreme cold and deprivation. Scurvy, which attacks the connective tissue of the body and renders the gums soft and the joints agonizing, would have been a serious threat to men whose diet had been without fresh food for over a year. Cold injuries, frostbite, which kills the extremities by freezing the blood within them, would have claimed fingers and toes, and the simple cumulative effect of cold, of inadequate nutrition, of the psychological weight of confinement in darkness would have taken its toll. Men do not die cleanly in these circumstances. They weaken, and the weakness makes them more vulnerable to further cold, and the cold deepens the weakness, and so it goes, in a slow and downward spiral that can take weeks or months to reach its conclusion. The captain, observing this in his crew, would have made entries in his log about the men, their conditions, their decline, perhaps their deaths. What did he write about the first man to die, the second? The tone of such entries, in the logs that have survived from other Arctic expeditions, tends toward a formal correctness that is its own form of feeling. The ship's surgeon, if the Octavius carried one, would have been consulted. A service would have been read. The man's possessions would have been inventoried. The entry would have been made. And then the log would have moved on to weather and position, and the daily observations that the captain's duty required. By November of the second year, how many of the crew remained? We do not know. The accounts that describe the discovery of the ship 13 years later suggest that the crew are found in their bunks, their attitudes suggesting sleep rather than agony, which might indicate that the end came while they were resting, perhaps during one of the colder nights when the temperature below decks dropped to levels that the diminished fuel supply could no longer counter. There is a particular mercy in dying in cold if the dying is done when one is already deeply chilled. The numbness that precedes the final stage is not, according to those who have survived close encounters with it, an unpleasant sensation. It is more like a loosening, a relaxation of the body's constant resistance against the cold, a giving in to something that has been pressing for a long time. Those who have been revived from near-fatal hypothermia sometimes describe the moments before unconsciousness as surprisingly peaceful, the body releasing its grip on the effort of staying warm. We cannot know what the crew of the Octavius felt in their final hours. We can only note that they were found in attitudes of rest, which is something. The woman and the child were found in a cabin with evidence of a fire nearby, a fire that had been lit and had burned and had gone out. Perhaps it went out because the fuel was exhausted. Perhaps it went out because there was no longer anyone who could tend it. The woman was found in a position that suggested she had arranged herself around the child in a posture of protection, which is the particular instinct that operates even at the very end, even when there is nothing more that can be done. The child was very small. The accounts say only that, very small. A child small enough to be wrapped entirely in the circle of a woman's arms and held there through the cold and the dark until neither of them could be held anymore. This is the hardest part of the story to carry. It does not require comment or elaboration. It is simply there, a fact of the record, a particular human weight in the middle of a tale that is otherwise about ships and ice and the ambitions of commerce. The captain, however, was not in his bunk. He was at his desk. He was in the chair, at the table, with the pen in his hand and the log open before him. The last entry was dated November 11th, 1762, and whatever it said it in the posture of a man who intended to go on, who sat at his desk with the pen in his hand, because sitting at one's desk with the pen in one's hand is what a captain does, and he was, until the very last moment of his capacity to be anything at all, a captain. What do you write? In the final entry of a log that no one will read until the world has moved on 13 years without you? What is the last thing you put on paper when you are the last person writing? We do not know what he wrote, but we know he wrote it, and we know that it was enough, that when the pen stopped moving it had not been thrown down or dropped in panic but set in place, the way a man sets down a pen when he has finished a thought. There are many ways to imagine those final moments. The one that seems most true to the character the record suggests is this: a man at his desk, in a ship that is very cold and very quiet, writing the last ordinary line of an extraordinary document, making the last entry with the same care he had given the first, doing his job until the job was done. The cold that took him would have been the same cold that had been pressing at the walls of the ship for over a year. It had been held at bay by the stove, by the blankets, by the body heat of the crew. And then, one by one, those sources of warmth had failed or diminished, and the cold had come in, as cold always does eventually, through the gaps. 13 years later, when the men of the Herald pushed open the cabin door and found him, the cold had been maintaining its perfect stillness for all that time. The ship was a kind of museum of the last moments of a voyage. Everything where it had been, everyone as they had been, the world they had inhabited preserved in the amber of the Arctic freeze. Rest here for a moment. You do not need to imagine anything difficult. Simply let the image be what it is: a ship, a desk, a man who did not stop writing. There is something in that which is not only sad but quietly remarkable. The cold did not make him give up. He was still at his desk. That is worth holding on to as the story moves forward into the long years of the ship's solitary voyage across the ice. After November 1762, the Octavius disappears from history for 13 years. This is the strangest and most meditative part of her story. For 13 years, a ship moved through the Arctic without a living soul aboard. She drifted in the ice currents and the wind currents, carried by forces she could not resist and did not need to understand. She was a passenger in the Arctic system, taken where the ice took her, held where the ice held her, released when the ice chose to release her. No one saw her, or if anyone did, if some Inuit hunter out on the ice saw a dark shape in the distance, a set of masts and rigging that seemed oddly still, they left no record that has reached us. The ship moved through a largely unwatched world. The Arctic in the 18th century was not surveyed, not mapped in any reliable detail, not frequented by anyone except the indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years, and the occasional European explorer who came and went with the seasons. What does it feel like to imagine a ship moving alone through those waters? There is something that the mind wants to resist about the image, the sense that a ship should be crewed, that the sea should be inhabited by the human intention that sends ships upon it. And yet the Arctic is full of drifting things. Icebergs move through the Arctic and then into the North Atlantic on journeys that take them thousands of miles from where they formed. Logs and debris wash along currents that circle the ocean without reference to human preference. A ship is simply a larger, more complex object in the same moving system. The Arctic has its own logic. It operates on timescales and by forces that the individual human life cannot contain. The ice forms and breaks and reforms. The currents run on patterns established over centuries. The great gyres of the Arctic Ocean move their contents, their ice, their cold water, their debris and detritus, in slow circles that have been circling since before the first human eye looked northward and wondered what lay at the top of the world. The Octavius moved through this system, her hull intact. We know it was intact when she was found, and there is no reason to think it was breached at any point in the drift, rode the ice and the currents. Her masts, still standing to some degree when she was found, caught the wind on the occasions when the ice released her into open water, and she moved under sail without anyone to manage the sails or choose the course. Where did she go? This is one of the great uncertainties of the story, and it is also perhaps the key to understanding why her legend has persisted. If the Octavius was trapped in the ice of the Canadian Arctic archipelago in 1761 and found east of Greenland in 1775, she must have passed through the Northwest Passage, the very route her captain had set out to find. This is a remarkable irony. The passage existed. It was navigable, at least in some conditions, at least in some years, but the ship that found it did so without anyone alive to navigate it, without anyone to record the course, without anyone to bring home the knowledge. The Northwest Passage was accomplished in a sense by the Octavius, but accomplished in a way that produced no useful information and no glory, only the quiet tragedy of a ship full of the dead completing a voyage that the living had died attempting. The question of whether the Northwest Passage was actually navigable by a ship with a living intentional crew was not definitively answered until much later. John Franklin's 1845 expedition, the most famous of all the Northwest Passage attempts, ended in the deaths of all 129 men aboard his two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. The passage was not successfully navigated by a crewed vessel until Roald Amundson's 3-year traverse between 1903 and 1906. But the Octavius, if the story is true, got there first. She got there first because she could not go anywhere else, because the ice moved her through the passage without asking her, as indifferent to the geographical significance of the route as the wind that filled her frozen sails. Let us follow her in imagination through those 13 years. Let us think about what the Arctic would have looked like from a ship that moved through it without understanding. In summer, the Arctic can be strikingly beautiful. The ice, when it retreats, reveals water of a deep, cold blue that is unlike any other blue in the world, a colour produced by the depth and clarity of the water and the particular quality of the light at high latitudes. The sun, which circles the sky without setting, produces a quality of illumination that is always slightly sideways, always coming in at an angle, casting long shadows even at midday, and giving the landscape a theatricality that painters who visited the Arctic tried, with varying success, to capture. In this light, the ice itself becomes extraordinary. The bergs that float in the summer channels are not simply white. They contain blue, deep, saturated blue in the cavities and fractures, the colour of something very old and very compressed. They contain green in the depths where the ice is thickest and the light penetrates only a little way. They contain, in their surfaces, the texture of a year's worth of weather, the ridges and hollows of wind-driven snow, the melt channels carved by the brief summer warmth, the dirt and debris of the sea floor picked up when the ice formed. The Octavius moved through this landscape. Her hull, dark against the ice and water, was a presence among other presences. The bergs, the seals that hauled themselves onto ice floes to sleep in the summer sun, the polar bears that moved along the ice with the deliberate efficiency of animals that have been the apex predator of this environment for a very long time. Whether any of these animals noticed her, we cannot know. The bears certainly would have investigated, with the thoroughness that a polar bear brings to anything that might be food. Finding no food, they would have moved on. In winter, the ship would have been locked in again, surrounded by ice, held still, enduring the darkness and the cold that were now the only company she had. The aurora would have played above her masts. The stars in the clear Arctic winter air would have been extraordinary in their number and their clarity, undimmed by any light but their own. And the silence of an ice-locked Arctic winter night, would have been absolute. A ship is never entirely silent, even when she is still. Wood works against itself in the cold, contracting and expanding in a series of small sounds that sailors hear as a kind of speech, the ship talking to herself, adjusting to the conditions, finding the accommodations that the cold requires. The ice presses and releases in a low, constant grinding that is as much felt as heard, a vibration in the hull that travels through the wood into the air of the cabins below. The sounds the Octavius made in those 13 years were heard by no one except the ice, but they were there. The crew, in their bunks and their chairs and their last positions, were preserved by the same cold that had taken them. The Arctic is a remarkable preserver. The cold prevents the processes of decay that would otherwise reduce organic material within months. What dies in the Arctic can be held in suspension almost indefinitely, which is why mammoths that lived 20,000 years ago have been found in Siberian permafrost, with their hair and their stomach contents intact. The crew of the Octavius would have been similarly preserved, not mummified exactly, but held in the cold in something that looked, from a distance, very much like sleep. This is part of what made the discovery 13 years later so deeply uncanny. The men who opened the hatches of the Octavius and went below did not find evidence of violence or struggle or disease. They found the crew in their expected places, in attitudes that suggested ordinary life interrupted rather than life ended. They found order. They found the ship, functionally speaking, intact. They found a captain at his desk, and they found a log that ended on a specific date, in the middle of a winter that had been over for more than a decade. Allow your body to be heavy now. Allow the darkness behind your closed eyes to be its own kind of Arctic. Quiet, still, without urgency. The ship has been drifting. The years have been passing. In 1775, something is about to change. But not yet. For now, simply drift. The ship that found the Octavius was called the Herald. She was a whaling vessel, operating in the waters off the west coast of Greenland in the late summer of 1775. Whaling was, in the 18th century, one of the primary industries that brought European ships into the waters of the North Atlantic and the Arctic fringes. The great bowhead whales that inhabited the cold waters were the primary source of the whale oil that lit the lamps of Europe and lubricated the machinery of the early industrial age. Whaling ships were not delicate vessels. They were built to work in cold, rough waters, to handle the violence of the hunt and the processing of animals that weighed dozens of tons. Their crews were experienced with conditions that would alarm the crews of merchant vessels, and they were accustomed to the peculiar hazards of northern waters. Ice, fog, sudden storms, the unpredictable behaviour of animals that, when harpooned, had the capacity to destroy a small boat with a single sweep of a fluke. The Herald's crew, in other words, were not people who frightened easily. They had seen strange things at sea, the things that northern waters produce, the occasional dead whale floating in its own oils, the wrecks of vessels that had met the ice at bad angles, the debris of other men's misfortunes that the currents collected and distributed across the North Atlantic. They knew how to evaluate what they found, and how to respond with the practical efficiency that their trade required. What they found on that day in 1775 was something they had not seen before. The fog in those waters is a constant presence in summer, produced by the meeting of cold Arctic air and the relatively warmer water that runs in from the south. It comes in banks, dense and disorienting, and then lifts, and what it reveals when it lifts is sometimes not what you expected to see. Sailors in fog learn to use their other senses, the sound of ice or of breaking water, the smell of the sea changing in ways that indicate shallowing ground, the feel of the wind shifting as a headland changes the airflow. When the fog lifted around the Herald that day, it revealed a ship. She was moving, or rather, she was drifting, on the current, without apparent steering, without anyone visible on her deck. Her sails, or what remained of them, were set in a way that suggested they had not been touched in a very long time. They were not the full managed canvas of a working ship. They were the remnant sails of a vessel that had been at the mercy of the wind for an extended period, tattered in places, frozen in the configuration they had found themselves in whenever the temperature had last been low enough to fix them that way. The Herald came alongside, hails were called. No one answered from the other ship. The master of the Herald sent a boat crew over to investigate. The men who boarded the Octavius found themselves entering a world that had been stopped. The deck was clear of snow. Presumably it had melted or been swept away in the summer thaw. The rigging was in a state that suggested long neglect rather than recent damage. The hatches were closed. When the boarding party opened them and descended below, they found the ship's interior in a condition that none of them had any frame of reference for. The crew were in their bunks. There were, by various accounts, 28 men, though the exact number varies depending on which version of the story you're working from. They lay in the positions of sleep, on their sides or on their backs, or curled against the cold. They did not appear, from a quick examination, to show the marks of violent death or prolonged suffering. They had simply stopped, the way a clock stops when the mechanism runs down. The cargo hold was intact. The ship's stores, such as remained of them, were in place. The structure of the Octavius was sound. No obvious damage to the hull, no evidence of the catastrophic failure that might have explained the absence of any survivors. And in the stern cabin, at his desk, was the captain. The accounts of the discovery describe him as sitting upright in his chair, his coat on, his hat on the table nearby. He was holding a pen. Before him on the desk was the ship's log, open to an entry. The last entry, dated November 11th, 1762. The ink was still legible. The handwriting was, by the accounts, orderly. Not the scrawl of a desperate man, but the considered cursive of someone who had been making a careful record. The men of the Herald stood in the cabin and looked at what they had found. The light coming through the cabin windows was the filtered grey light of the Arctic summer, enough to see by, not enough to make the scene look like anything other than what it was. A man at his desk, a pen in his hand, a logbook with a date from 13 years ago. What does a practical man do with a discovery like this? The master of the Herald, his name is given in some accounts as Warren, though this too is uncertain, had a practical mind and a ship to run, and a cargo to account for, and men who were looking to him for a response that made sense. He could not take the Octavius in tow. She was too large for that, and he had a whale hunt to continue. He could not leave a prize crew aboard her. He did not have the men to spare, and in any case the Octavius was not a prize in any conventional sense. What he could do was take the log, and this, apparently, is what happened. The master or his officers retrieved the log from the captain's desk, dislodging, presumably, the pen that had been held in the dead captain's hand, or perhaps taking the pen as well, and carried it back to the Herald as the only record of what the ship had been and where she had gone. The Octavius was left behind. The Herald resumed her voyage, and the derelict ship continued her drift, going wherever the current and the wind took her, carrying her dead through the waters of the North Atlantic in the summer of 1775, alone again. What happened to the Octavius after the Herald left her is unknown. She may have drifted for additional years before finally sinking, either swamped by weather, or damaged by ice, or simply rotted to the point where the sea came in through the seams. She may have grounded on some rocky coast. She may have been encountered by other vessels who did not record the meeting. She simply disappears from history again, as though the Arctic had taken her back. The log was brought back to England. What exactly it said, what the captain's entries contained, what account he gave of the entrapment in the winter and the slow failure of the voyage, is not preserved in any verified form. The log itself has not been located in any archive. What we have is the account of those who saw it, filtered through the retellings that constitute the historical record of the Octavius. And that historical record is itself a layered thing, part documented fact, part legend, the two so thoroughly intertwined that separating them requires more than anyone has yet managed. Let the fog of that uncertainty settle around you, gently. It is not the fog of ignorance, but the fog of genuine mystery, the kind that surrounds events that were real and important, but were not witnessed by anyone who then wrote it all down cleanly and left the document somewhere it could be found. The fog is part of the story. The story would not be the same without it. Rest in that fog for a moment. Let it be soft rather than obscuring. The story continues on the other side of it, in the light of what the evidence suggests and what the imagination, guided by careful thought, can reach. Every historical mystery has a moment where the record thins and the legend thickens. The story of the Octavius reaches that moment in the examination of its primary sources. The earliest detailed account of the discovery appears in the narrative of William Scoresby, an Arctic whaling captain who was also one of the most careful and systematic observers of the Arctic world in the early 19th century. Scoresby published a 2-volume account of Arctic whaling in 1820, and within it he included the story of the Octavius, describing the ship, the discovery, the frozen captain, and the log. Scoresby is a credible source. He was a scientist as well as a sailor, with a serious interest in the natural phenomena of the Arctic and a methodology that reflects genuine care for accuracy. He was not, in general, a man who repeated stories he believed to be false. and yet his account of the Octavius is not accompanied by the kinds of primary documents, the actual log, the records of the Herald's voyage, the depositions of the crew who boarded the ship, that would allow verification of the specific claims. This is not unusual for the period and the type of event. The 18th century records of the British whaling industry are not complete or consistently preserved. Ship logs from merchant and whaling vessels were not routinely archived in the systematic way that the logs of Royal Navy vessels were. The log of the Octavius, if brought back by the Herald, would have been the property of the owners of the Octavius, assuming those owners could be identified and located after a 13-year disappearance, or of the insurers who had written policies on the vessel, or perhaps of the Admiralty courts that dealt with maritime matters. It is not impossible that it was deposited somewhere and then lost in the ordinary attrition of paper documents over centuries. The name of the Octavius herself presents complications. The maritime records of the 18th century are imperfect, and a vessel of this type might appear in the records under variations of the name, or under a different name entirely if she had been renamed at some point, or not at all if her registration was in a port whose records were poorly kept. Historians have searched for a vessel named Octavius that matches the story and have not found a clean match. This does not mean the ship did not exist. It means the evidence is fragmentary, as evidence for many real events of that period is fragmentary. The absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence. What the historical record does provide, beyond Scoresby's account, is a context that makes the story entirely plausible. The Northwest Passage was a real obsession of the period. Ships did disappear in the Arctic, many ships, including some that were never found at all. The ice of the Canadian Arctic archipelago did trap vessels. The conditions that the story describes, the entrapment, the winter, the slow failure of the crew, the preservation of the bodies by the cold, are all consistent with what actually happened to other expeditions in those waters. The Franklin expedition of 1845, which is well documented, ended in precisely the circumstances that the Octavius legend describes, on a larger scale. The ships Terror and Erebus were trapped in the ice. The crew survived 2 winters before the ships were abandoned. The men who walked out onto the ice to try to reach safety died of cold and scurvy, and lead poisoning from their canned provisions. The last of them were found, years later, by search expeditions that documented what they found with the care that the Victorian age brought to record keeping. The Octavius story is an 18th century prototype of the Franklin disaster. Less well documented, perhaps partly legendary, but not inherently implausible. The conditions were real. The outcome was the kind of outcome that real ships and real men met in real Arctic winters. But the story has accumulated details over the centuries that are harder to assess. The woman and the child, for instance. This detail appears in some accounts and not others. The specific date of the last log entry, November 11th, 1762, is vivid and precise in a way that makes it feel either very authentic or very constructed for effect. The image of the captain with the pen still in his hand is one of those details that feels almost too perfect, too emblematic of the themes the story wants to carry. Perfect details make historians nervous. Real events are often messy in their specifics, approximate in their dates, uncertain in their particulars, resistant to the neat emblematic images that narrative prefers. The pen in the captain's hand is the kind of detail that, if it is true, is remarkable in its symbolic precision, and if it is embellished, added or sharpened in the retellings, it is a detail added by someone who understood what the story was about and wanted to make sure the image conveyed it. What is the story about? At its simplest, it is about a man who kept doing his job until he could not, about a captain who did not abandon his post or his log or his professional duty even when the conditions that had made that duty meaningful had long since ceased to obtain, about the persistence of human intention against the Arctic's absolute indifference to human plans. These are themes that resonate across the centuries. They are themes that the whaling captain Scoresby, who understood as well as anyone what the Arctic demands of men, would have found compelling, and they are themes that, once attached to an event, have a way of stabilizing the story, of giving it the weight and the shape that makes it worth repeating. The telling of a story changes the story. Each retelling adds something, clarifies something, loses something. The Octavius that the Herald found in 1775, assuming she found it, assuming the event occurred, was a specific ship with specific people aboard, in specific conditions that only the crew of the Herald actually saw. The Octavius that enters the historical record through Scoresby's account, and then grows through subsequent retellings, is something more than that. She's a story with all the shapeliness and ambiguity that stories carry. Both versions are real. The historical ship is real in the way that documented events are real. Contingent, partial, verified to the degree that the evidence allows. The legendary ship is real in the way that resonant stories are real, carrying meaning that outlasts the specifics, speaking to something in the human experience of isolation and endurance in the cold. Consider, as you rest, what the difference is. Is it possible for something to be both less than fully documented and more than fully invented? Is there a space between those two categories where the Octavius lives? A space where the essential truth of the story is preserved even if some of the details have been smoothed and polished over time? These are questions that historians and philosophers argue about with some energy. They're also questions that the human brain, settling into sleep, tends to set aside in favour of the story itself, the ship, the ice, the man at his desk, the pen still in his hand. There is wisdom in that. The details can be examined in the waking hours. For now, the story is enough. Let it carry you forward, gently, through the years and the cold, into the world that followed the discovery of the Octavius and the questions it left behind. Breathe slowly. The story knows where it is going. You only need to follow. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Octavius continues her story now, moving through the waters of history and imagination, carrying us deeper into the mystery of the frozen north. The Octavius was not the only ship the Arctic took and kept. The waters north of Canada and Alaska are, in the long view of maritime history, a graveyard of considerable size and diversity. From the earliest European attempts to navigate those channels in the 16th century, through the great era of exploration in the 19th, ships went north and did not come back with a regularity that would have, if tallied, given any rational person pause. The Arctic did not care about the importance of the mission, or the quality of the ship or the experience of the crew. It simply acted as it always had acted according to its own laws, and the ships that encountered it in the wrong season, or the wrong configuration or the wrong year disappeared. Henry Hudson went north in 1610 with a crew that eventually mutinied and set him adrift in the great bay that now carries his name. The mutineers who returned to England faced trial, but were acquitted on the grounds that their testimony about the voyage was too valuable to be lost by executing them. Hudson himself was never found. The bay held him, and whatever happened to him in the small boat that the mutineers left him with is one of the many questions that the Arctic keeps. The Danish expedition of Jens Munk in 1619 ended in the deaths of 61 of the 64 men who had set out. Munk, who survived along with 2 others, wrote a detailed and harrowing account of the winter, the scurvy, the cold, the deaths of the men one by one, the final days when only a handful remained and the ship was surrounded by the bodies of those who had died before they could be buried. He made it home. His account is one of the most precise records of what an Arctic winter did to men who were not prepared for it. William Baffin explored the bay that bears his name in 1616 and concluded, incorrectly, that it had no western outlet, a conclusion that sent subsequent explorers in the wrong direction for years. The true western outlets of Baffin Bay, the channels that led into the heart of the archipelago and toward the passage, were not identified as routes until much later. Each of these expeditions, and the dozens of others that the 18th and 19th centuries produced, contributed to a slowly accumulating body of knowledge about the Arctic. They charted coastlines. They noted the behaviour of the ice in different seasons. They described the tides and the currents. They documented the wildlife and the weather, and they established through the painful process of experience what the Arctic actually required of those who entered it, not courage alone, which they had, but a specific preparation for the specific conditions, which was more difficult to acquire. The Octavius, by the story's account, was not specifically prepared for Arctic conditions. She was a merchant vessel that turned north on the decision of her captain, and whatever preparation was made would have been improvised rather than systematic. This is not a criticism of the captain or the crew. It reflects the state of knowledge at the time and the nature of a decision made in the Pacific, thousands of miles from the conditions it would be confronting. But it does help explain why the venture ended as it did. The ships that were specifically designed and equipped for Arctic work, the exploration vessels that the 19th century expeditions used, double-hulled and ice-reinforced and provisioned for 3 or more years, did not always survive either. The Erebus and the Terror, Franklin's ships, were naval vessels of considerable capability, and they did not come back. The conditions of the Arctic, in the wrong year, with the wrong ice configuration, were beyond what even the best preparation could guarantee against. A merchant vessel like the Octavius, caught in the wrong channel in the wrong autumn, was at the mercy of conditions that no amount of seamanship could entirely overcome. The ice did not care about seamanship. It closed when it was ready to close, and it held what it closed around with a patience that had no relationship to anything human. The ships that the Arctic took outnumber the ships that successfully navigated its waters by a considerable margin. This is not well known, because the ships that were lost did not come back with records of their losses. The record that history produces is biased toward the survivors, toward the men who made it home and wrote their accounts and gave their testimonies and received their awards or their condemnations. The men who did not make it home left only what could be inferred from the searchers who came afterward, and the searchers did not always come, or came too late to find anything but debris. The Inuit peoples who had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years knew this landscape in a way that no European explorer ever managed to replicate. Their knowledge of the ice, its seasonal movements, its safe passages, the places where it thickened and where it thinned, the sounds it made before it broke, was precise and detailed and built up over generations of careful observation. They knew how to travel on the ice, how to build shelters within it, how to hunt the animals that inhabited it, how to read the weather that moved over it. European explorers who interacted with Inuit peoples in the Arctic generally received valuable information from them. The information was not always acted upon, because the cultural assumption that European methods were superior to indigenous ones was pervasive and costly. Expeditions that dismissed what the Inuit told them about the ice tended to pay for the dismissal in ways that the Inuit had warned them about. The Inuit had no tradition of the kind of long-distance maritime voyaging that European exploration required. Their craft were adapted to the specific conditions of the Arctic coast. Kayaks, brilliant designs that allowed 1 or 2 people to navigate coastal and nearshore waters with a speed and maneuverability that no European vessel of the period could match. But they did not sail the open sea in the way that European exploration required, and they did not, in general, venture into the channels of the archipelago in the kind of weather and conditions that trapped the European ships. They watched, from their own knowledge and experience, what happened to the ships that came north without adequate preparation for what they would find. And they sometimes helped the survivors, providing food and shelter and guidance to men who'd been reduced by the Arctic to a dependence on the knowledge of others. The Octavius had no such help available. She was somewhere in the channels of the archipelago, in conditions that left no margin for the ordinary commerce between peoples that might have provided some assistance. Whether she was in a position to be reached by Inuit hunters or traders, we cannot know. Whether any of the crew in those long months of entrapment made contact with the indigenous peoples of the region is not recorded in any account of the ship's story. What we can imagine, though, is the sound of the land. The Arctic is not, in summer, a silent place. The Inuit camps on the coast. The sounds of dogs and children and the particular commerce of a people, living their ordinary lives in extraordinary conditions, would have been present somewhere in the region. The seabirds that nest in millions on the cliff faces of the Arctic islands make a noise in summer that carries great distances over the water. The ice itself, as it works, produces sounds that experienced ears can interpret. The crew of the Octavius, in whatever weeks they retained the capacity to hear and attend, would have existed within a soundscape of remarkable strangeness. The sounds of a world they had not been designed to inhabit, full of information they did not know how to read, the creaking of the ice, the distant calling of birds, the wind which in the Arctic can change its tone entirely depending on the configuration of ice and water through which it moves. And then, gradually, the sounds would have become less distinct. The capacity to attend to them would have diminished as the cold deepened and the hunger grew, and the human systems that process the world shut down one by one in their orderly way. And then silence. That silence lasted 13 years, and then the Herald's boat crew arrived and pushed open hatches, and the silence was briefly interrupted by the sounds of living men moving through a space that had been without them for a very long time. Let that silence come to you now. Let it be the silence of your room, of your night, of wherever you are in this quiet hour. The story is still moving, but it moves slowly, the way cold water moves. You do not need to keep up with it. It will find you wherever you are. The Northwest Passage exists. This is now a fact rather than a speculation, though it took centuries of effort and many lives to establish it with certainty. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who had already distinguished himself in polar work, navigated the passage between 1903 and 1906 in a small vessel called the Gjøa. He took 3 years because the ice in the key sections of the route required him to winter over twice, waiting for conditions that would allow him to proceed. He succeeded, emerged into the Pacific in 1906 with the knowledge that the passage was real and that it could be navigated by a ship of sufficient capability and patience. Amundsen's success came more than 3 centuries after the first serious attempts to find the passage. In those 3 centuries, the cost in ships and men had been extraordinary. The passage had claimed more than it had yielded, and it had yielded almost nothing except the slowly accumulating understanding of what the Arctic actually was. Not a short route to anywhere, but a vast and indifferent environment that operated by its own rules and answered to no one's commercial ambitions. The irony of the Octavius, if the story is true, is that her ghost navigation of the passage accomplished what Amundsen spent 3 years trying to do, and accomplished it without anyone on board to care or to benefit. A ship of the dead, drifting through the passage that had obsessed the maritime world for centuries, completing the voyage in a way that produced no knowledge and no triumph, only the haunting image of a derelict vessel emerging east of Greenland with her captain frozen at his desk. Why did the passage take so long to find? The answer is partly geographical and partly seasonal. The Canadian Arctic archipelago is a maze of islands and channels, some of which are blocked by ice for most or all of the year. The navigable route through it depends heavily on the specific year's ice conditions, which vary significantly from one year to the next. A route that seems open in one summer may be completely blocked in the next. The pattern of open and closed channels is not regular enough to be predicted reliably from the outside. The explorers who attempted the passage were working from maps that were partially wrong, in a region where the margin for error was very small. A wrong turn in the archipelago could put a ship into a channel that dead-ended in ice, and getting out of such a channel against the prevailing current and wind was often impossible. The ship would be pressed further in, not out, until the ice closed around her and the winter arrived and the situation became irreversible. The Franklin expedition of 1845 ended this way. The ships pushed into a channel that seemed promising, the ice closing behind them, the second winter arriving before they could escape, and then the decision to abandon the ships and march south over the ice toward the mainland, a march that killed everyone. The ships themselves, the Erebus and the Terror, sank and rested on the bottom of the Arctic Sea for over a century and a half before they were found by underwater surveys in the 21st century, the Terror in 2016, the Erebus in 2014. Finding the ships at the bottom of the sea, preserved by the cold in remarkable condition, produced a particular kind of resonance. You could look at photographs of the Terror's galley and see the shelves still holding some of their stores, the iron stove that had tried to heat the ship through 2 Arctic winters, the structure of a world that had been ended abruptly and then held in suspension for more than 160 years. It was the Octavius story in a modern documented form, the uncanny preservation of the ordinary world of a ship's interior found after an absence that had crossed into legend. The archaeology of lost ships in the Arctic is, in some ways, the archaeology of human ambition at its most extreme. The ships went north carrying not just cargo and crews, but the weight of the aspirations of the age that sent them. Commercial ambitions, scientific aspirations, the desire for national prestige, the specific personal ambitions of the men who commanded them. All of that goes down with the ship, or is frozen with the crew, or drifts with the derelict through the channels of the archipelago until something or someone finds it. The finds, when they come, always carry that weight. when searchers found the camps of the Franklin expedition's last survivors on the islands of the Canadian Arctic, they found the detritus of a Victorian naval expedition that had tried to maintain its culture in conditions that had no regard for it. Silver cutlery and fine china, brought on a voyage into the wilderness, found scattered across the Arctic tundra where desperate men had set them down. There is something in this that speaks to the human need to carry the familiar into the unfamiliar, to assert the continuity of the world you come from against the world you have entered. The Franklin men brought their silver because silver was what officers of the Royal Navy used at table, and they were Royal Navy officers even in the ice, even when the ice was killing them. The culture persisted past the point where it could be practically useful, because culture is not primarily about practical utility. The captain of the Octavius sat at his desk and kept his log because a captain keeps his log. The form was maintained past the point where it served any practical purpose. The observations of position were presumably blank, or approximate beyond usefulness, once the ship was locked in a fixed position by the ice. But the act of writing, of maintaining the record, of being the kind of man who sits at his desk and makes his entries, persisted past the practical into something else, into the purely human insistence on acting like oneself, even when the world has ceased to provide the conditions in which being oneself makes practical sense. This is a quietly profound thing. It is something that the Arctic, of all places, brings out with particular clarity, because the Arctic removes so much of the scaffolding on which ordinary human identity hangs. The comfortable furniture of civilized life falls away. The social relationships and professional roles and habitual activities that define a person in ordinary circumstances lose their ordinary supports. What remains, when all of that is gone, is whatever the person actually is. The core that the circumstances cannot strip away because it is not dependent on the circumstances. Some men, when reduced to that core, discover something they did not know was there. The accounts of Arctic survival are full of stories of ordinary men who, in extremis, produced extraordinary things, endurance that seemed impossible, resourcefulness that drew on reserves no one knew they had, care for others that persisted past the point where self-interest alone would have recommended withdrawal. And some men discover that the core is smaller than they hoped, or different in character from what they believed. The Arctic, which is absolutely indifferent to what a man hopes to find in himself, sometimes reveals things that are not comfortable to find. The captain of the Octavius, sitting at his desk in November of 1762, with the pen in his hand and the log open before him, was enacting whatever he had found in himself. He was writing. He was still writing. The cold was coming, and the fuel was almost gone, and the crew was diminished, and the season was deep in its second Arctic winter, and he was writing. What else would he do? He was the captain. Captains write in their logs. There is a completeness in that which does not require elaboration. The form contains the meaning. The act is the expression. A man who keeps writing until he cannot write anymore has made a statement about himself that is more precise and more lasting than any of the words he wrote. Let that thought come to rest, gently, like snow, which does not land with any urgency but arrives simply because the conditions are right, and settles where it settles and covers what it covers, quietly and without announcement. The passage he was trying to find will wait a little longer for its successful navigation. There are other things to consider first: the world that mourned the Octavius, and the questions her discovery left unanswered, and the long afterlife of a story that has kept its secrets well. When the Octavius left England in 1761, the world was a particular kind of place. It was the world of the mid-18th century, the world of Enlightenment ideas and expanding trade, and the beginnings of the processes that would, within a generation, produce the Industrial Revolution. It was a world that was changing faster than most people who lived in it fully understood, but that was changing in ways that still had the texture of the old world, in the material world of ships and warehouses and counting houses, and the long, slow rhythms of commerce by sea. In 1762, while the Octavius was somewhere in the ice, and her captain was writing the last entry in his log, Britain was concluding the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that had been fought in Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean, and that would leave Britain as the dominant maritime and commercial power in the world. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, transferred enormous territories from France to Britain, and established the framework within which the remaining decades of the 18th century would be played out. The owners of the Octavius, whoever they were, whatever trading firm had commissioned her voyage, would have reported her missing at some point after it became clear she was not returning on schedule. The insurance process, which was well developed in the mid-18th century through institutions like Lloyd's of London, would have assessed the loss and paid out what the policy provided. The Octavius would have been written off in the financial records of her owners as a total loss. The families of the crew would have received whatever notification was standard in the period, which was not much, a letter perhaps from the owners informing them that the vessel was overdue and presumed lost, a settlement of the wages owing at the time the ship was last heard from, and then the ordinary absence that follows when someone goes to sea and does not come back, which in the 18th century was not an unusual thing, and which society had developed, in its way, a means of absorbing. The wives of sailors who did not return were in a particular legal limbo. A woman whose husband had gone to sea and not come back was not, until the passing of a suitable period, legally a widow. She could not remarry. She could not claim any legal status as a widow. She was simply a woman whose husband was absent, perhaps at the bottom of the sea, perhaps in some distant port where the mail had not reached, perhaps alive in circumstances she could not know. This uncertainty, which must have been one of the specific torments of the maritime life, was managed in various ways, by remarrying without waiting for the legal formality, by falling back on family support, by working, by simply waiting. The children of the crew, if any of the crew had children, would have grown up in their father's absence. By 1775, when the Herald found the Octavius, the children of men who had sailed on her in 1761 would have been teenagers or young adults, old enough to understand what the discovery meant, old enough for the news, if it reached them, to close a question that had perhaps been held open for 13 years, not by hope exactly, but by the simple absence of a definitive answer. What does it do to a family to have the question closed that way, to receive confirmation that the absent man is dead, but confirmation that arrives 13 years late, in the form of a report from a whaling vessel that found the ship adrift with the crew frozen in their bunks? The news is not a surprise by 1775. 13 years of silence would have settled into an acceptance that the ship was gone. But there is something different about not knowing and knowing, even when the knowing is late and arrives in so strange a form. The captain's family, if he had one, which we do not know, would have had the additional weight of the image. A man at his desk, a pen in his hand, a log entry from November 1762. The specific knowledge of those last circumstances, more than a decade after the fact, is a particular kind of information to receive. It puts a face and a posture on an absence that had, perhaps, become general enough to be carried. The woman in the cabin below, we do not know who she was or what her history was or who was waiting for her at home. We do not know whether the child with her was her child or someone else's child in her care, or whether the child had its own separate family that was waiting somewhere in England or wherever they had come from. These are the specific human losses that the story preserves in outline but not in detail. The people behind the facts, whose lives and relationships and particular griefs are gone. By the time the Octavius was found in 1775, the world had moved on in the ways that worlds move on. The 7 Years' War had been over for 12 years. The American Revolution had begun. The battles of Lexington and Concord had been fought in April of that year, and the colonists of North America were in the process of becoming something other than British subjects. The maritime world was adjusting to the new realities that the political changes produced. The owners of the Octavius, if they were still in business, had long since absorbed her loss and moved on to other ships and other voyages. The insurance company that had paid out on her had processed the claim and distributed the funds and closed the file. The Octavius existed, in the financial and commercial records of 1775, only as a settled claim from 13 years ago, a loss, a number, a note in an account book. And then the Herald came back to port and reported what she had found. And suddenly the Octavius existed again, not as an active commercial vessel, but as a story, a mystery, a piece of news that was sufficiently strange and sufficiently arresting to spread through the maritime community and beyond it. News travelled slowly in 1775, but it travelled. The sailors who had boarded the Octavius told their story in port, and the story was picked up and passed on, and it reached the people who write things down, and from the people who write things down it entered the broader circulation of information that constituted the 18th century news environment. The story had all the qualities that make stories spread. It was strange, it was specific, it had a central image, the captain at his desk, the pen in his hand, that was immediately graspable and immediately evocative. It had a mystery at its heart, the 13 years of the drift, the passage through the Northwest Passage that no one had managed to navigate, the question of what the log said, that gave it the quality of a puzzle that was also a tragedy. Stories with those qualities do not die easily. They get told and retold, each telling adding something and losing something, until the story that circulates is partly the original event and partly the accretion of all the tellings. This is not a flaw in the process, it is simply how stories work, how the essential meaning of an event becomes over time more concentrated and more clear, even as the specific details become less verifiable. The Octavius, by the time Scoresby wrote about her in 1820, was already a story with this quality of concentrated meaning. The specific ship, with her specific crew, her specific captain, her specific cargo and course, had become the archetype of something larger, of the fate of a ship in the Arctic, of human ambition meeting natural indifference, of the particular tragedy of dying unknown in a place that no one was watching. By the time you encounter the story now, it has been circulating for 2.5 centuries. It has been told in maritime histories, in collections of sea mysteries, in articles and books, and now in this form. A quiet narration in the dark, for someone who is settling towards sleep and willing to let the past come to them gently. The world that sent the Octavius north is gone. The world that received the news of her discovery is gone. But the story persists. It will persist as long as there are people who are moved by it, as long as the image of a man writing at his desk in the Arctic cold has the power to reach across the centuries and mean something. It means something. That is why you are here. Let the meaning settle. Let it rest alongside you in the dark, quiet and warm, while the cold of the story remains at a comfortable distance. There, but not touching, illuminating without chilling. The preservation of the Octavius' dead is the element of the story that most directly challenges our intuitions about what time does to things. We live in a world shaped by the understanding that time is corrosive, that things left to themselves decay, deteriorate, return to the simpler components from which they were made. Organic material rots, metal rusts, wood softens and crumbles. This is the ordinary expectation, and it is correct for the ordinary environment. The processes that reduce organic material to its constituents are biological processes, the work of bacteria, of fungi, of the small and constant labour of decomposition that is as fundamental to the living world as growth itself. But these processes require specific conditions. They require warmth above a certain threshold, and moisture of a certain degree, and often oxygen. Deny them any of these requirements, and the process slows or stops entirely. The Arctic, which provides cold far below any threshold that supports bacterial decomposition, and which in winter provides conditions of extreme dryness as well as extreme cold, is one of the most effective natural preservatives in the world. The evidence for this is remarkable. Mammoths frozen in Siberian permafrost have been found with their flesh, their hair, and even their stomach contents intact after 20,000 years. Seeds recovered from Arctic permafrost have germinated after being frozen for more than 30,000 years. The permafrost of the Arctic and Antarctic preserves ancient microorganisms in a state of suspended animation from which they can, in principle, be revived. A fact that has implications for astrobiology, for the study of life on other cold worlds that are still being worked out. The bodies of men who died in Arctic cold have been found centuries after their deaths, in states of preservation that were initially startling to those who found them. The Inuit of the Eastern Arctic, whose burial traditions involved placing the dead in locations exposed to the cold, left bodies that were found centuries later, preserved in ways that allowed forensic analysis of their diet, their health, their clothing, and even their genetic material. The crew of the Octavius, in the account of their discovery, appear to have been similarly preserved. 13 years is not, in Arctic terms, a particularly long time. The conditions that preserved a mammoth for 20 millennia would have had no difficulty maintaining the state of a human body for 13 years. The cold would have arrested every biological process of decomposition within hours of death, and maintained that arrest for as long as the temperature remained below the threshold at which the processes could resume. The captain's pen, still in his hand after 13 years, is entirely consistent with this understanding. The hand that held it would have been frozen in place, not withered or decayed, but preserved in the position it was in when the cold took hold. The ink in the pen would have dried, the log would have been brittle with the cold, its pages stiff. But the essential structure of the scene, a man at a desk with a pen in his hand, would have been maintained with a fidelity that the warm world does not permit. There is something philosophically interesting about this. We tend to think of the past as having happened and then having gone, as being accessible only through the traces it left, the documents and the artifacts and the memories. But in the Arctic, the past is sometimes not gone. It is simply frozen, present in a state of suspension that is neither the past's ordinary mode of persistence nor quite alive, but something between, a kind of held moment that the cold has refused to release. The men who descended into the Octavius in 1775 were entering a held moment. The moment was from 1762, from 13 years ago, from a specific November that the cold had sealed like a letter. They were seeing something that no one had seen since the last survivor of the crew lost the capacity to see it. They were present at a scene from the past, not as historians reading about it, but as witnesses standing in it. This is a strange experience for the human mind to process. The ordinary markers by which we distinguish past from present are temporal rather than spatial. The past is what is behind us in time, not what is in a different location. But the Arctic collapses this distinction. The past in the Arctic can be in a different location rather than a different time, accessible by ship, by crossing a distance rather than by crossing time. The Octavius was not further back in time than 1775 when the Herald found her. She was simply in a different place, a place where the ordinary arrow of time had been interrupted. This has a quality that sleep thinking recognizes even when waking thinking struggles with it. The dream sense of time is not the linear sense of waking. In the space where the mind goes towards sleep, the past and the present are not so clearly separated. A memory can have the vividness of a current experience. A current experience can have the quality of something already known, already lived. The categories blur pleasantly. The Arctic blurs categories in a different way, physically rather than mentally. But the effect is not entirely dissimilar. A scene held in ice for 13 years has the quality of a memory, present but not current, real but not available to change. The men of the Herald, standing in the captain's cabin, were in some sense inside someone else's memory. They were inside the last moment of the Octavius, preserved by the cold in the configuration of that moment. The captain at his desk was not performing that action in the present. He was frozen in the moment of having performed it, and the cold had made that moment available across 13 years, as vivid and as specific as if it had just occurred. No one, that we know of, wrote extensively about what this felt like from the inside. The accounts we have are practical rather than philosophical. They describe what was found, not what was experienced in the finding. But it is reasonable to assume that the men of the Herald, boarding a ship full of the dead preserved in the positions of the living, felt something that the practical language of their reports did not fully capture. Fear, perhaps. The uncanny has that effect. The thing that looks normal but is not. The posture of life in a context that is death. The captain, seen through the cabin window before the door was opened, might have appeared alive. A man at his desk in good order, attending to his work. The discovery that he was not alive would have arrived as a specific kind of shock. The shock of something that has violated an expectation that the eye had formed before the mind could correct it. Wonder also. The preservation of the scene was, by any practical standard, remarkable. The ship that had been missing for 13 years was intact. The crew that had been lost were present. The log that recorded the voyage was still there, for men accustomed to the ordinary fate of ships that disappeared in the Arctic, which was generally to disappear entirely, leaving no trace, no record, no evidence of what had happened. The Octavius must have seemed like something close to miraculous. And underneath the fear and the wonder, something quieter, something that the cold itself communicates to those who are in its presence. The Arctic cold is not, in the end, malevolent. It does not have intentions. It does not pursue or punish. It simply is, a condition of the world in that place and at that time, neutral as the sky, indifferent as the sea. The cold that took the captain did not take him with any particular feeling about it. It simply arrived, and he was in its way, and it did what cold does. There is a certain peace in that. Not comfort, exactly. The fact of the cold is not comfortable, but a kind of acceptance that the cold makes available if you allow yourself to rest in the understanding of it rather than resist it. The cold is not your enemy. It is simply part of the world doing what it does, as the dark does what the dark does and the sea does what the sea does. Let that understanding settle over you now. You are warm. The cold of the story is far away from you, held at a narrative distance that keeps it interesting without making it threatening. The captain is still at his desk and the pen is still in his hand, and the cold is doing what cold does, and you are somewhere safe and warm and on your way to sleep. This is a good place to be. The Octavius belongs to a category of stories that the sea has always produced, the ghost ship. The ghost ship is one of the oldest and most persistent of maritime legends, and like most persistent legends, it draws its power from a recognizable human experience. The experience of encountering something that should not be there, something that is present in a way that violates the normal order of things, a ship without a crew, sailing on its own, a vessel adrift with all signs of life present and all life absent, a ship from the past, encountered in the present, carrying the evidence of what happened to it like a message in a bottle that the sea finally chose to deliver. The most famous ghost ship of the maritime tradition is the Flying Dutchman, a vessel cursed to sail the seas forever, never reaching port, encountered by other ships as a terrible omen. The legend of the Dutchman is not a historical record of a specific event, but a mythological construct that the maritime culture produced to give shape to a particular anxiety. The anxiety of the sea as a place where the ordinary rules about life and death might not fully apply. At sea, the ordinary scaffolding of ordinary life is removed. The social order of the land, the institutions, the relationships, the shared conventions that structure daily life, gives way to the simpler and more primal order of the ship. On the ship, the captain's word is law, the sea's mood is the primary variable, and the relationship between human intention and physical outcome is more immediate and more consequential than on land. People die at sea in ways they do not die on land. Ships disappear in ways that buildings do not disappear. The sea takes things without explanation and keeps them without apology. The ghost ship legend is the maritime world's way of processing this. The ship that will not stay gone, that keeps appearing to other mariners, that is found drifting without explanation, that carries its dead through the waters long after the living should have provided some accounting of it, is a story about the sea's refusal to be categorized, about the way that the sea keeps its own records and follows its own logic, indifferent to the records and logic of the human world. The Octavius fits this archetype almost perfectly. She disappeared. She was mourned, or at least written off. She became part of the category of ships lost at sea, a category large enough in the history of maritime commerce that individual entries within it blurred into a general statistical loss. And then, 13 years later, she emerged from that category, refusing its finality, presenting herself to the Herald as a specific ship with a specific history, her dead evidence against the clean accounting the financial world had made of her loss. Other ghost ships that the historical record preserves in various degrees of certainty include the Mary Celeste, found in 1872 in the Atlantic with no crew aboard, her cargo intact, her lifeboat missing, the captain's log breaking off 10 days before the discovery with no indication of what had happened. The Mary Celeste has been analysed and speculated about for a century and a half. None of the analyses have produced a solution that is both consistent with the evidence and fully satisfying. She remains mysterious, and the mystery has been productive, generating explanations ranging from the mundane and plausible to the wildly speculative. The Carroll A. Deering, found run aground off Cape Hatteras in 1921 with no crew, and evidence of an interrupted meal on the galley stove, prompted one of the most extensive maritime investigations in American history. The investigation concluded nothing definitive. The ship remains unexplained, and the region where she was found, the area known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, which is also associated with the Bermuda Triangle mythos, has absorbed her mystery into its broader reputation for the inexplicable. These cases share the essential quality that makes the Octavius compelling: the presence of the ship without the crew, the evidence of normal life interrupted, the absence of any explanation adequate to the evidence. They produce the specific uncanny quality of the ghost ship legend, not the ghost that appears in transparent form and speaks of the underworld, but the ghost that is simply missing from a scene where all the other evidence of its existence remains. The Mary Celeste had a half-eaten meal on her table, the Carol Deering had a meal cooking, the Octavius had a captain at his desk with a pen in his hand. Each image is a variant of the same fundamental strangeness: the moment frozen in the middle of the ongoing, the life implied but not present, the world waiting for a return that will not come. What makes these stories endure is not the mystery exactly. Mysteries can be frustrating as well as compelling, and many mysteries simply close without resolution and are forgotten. What makes them endure is the image at their centre. The right image has a staying power that outlasts any explanation, because the image carries meaning that explanation does not exhaust. The explanation, if it were found, might satisfy curiosity while diminishing resonance. The mystery keeps the image alive in its full ambiguity, which is where its meaning lives. The pen in the captain's hand is exactly this kind of image. It is an image of continuation, of the act of writing, arrested mid-act, preserved at the moment of its performance, rather than at the moment of its completion. It is an image about the relationship between the living and the dead that is more precise than any direct statement about it could be. Here is a man who was writing, and here is the writing, and the gap between them. The gap where the man's intention and the world's reality fail to connect is where the meaning lives. Ghost ship stories are ultimately stories about this gap, about the difference between what was planned and what happened, about the ships that set out with full intention and clear purpose, and came to ends that their intentions could not have predicted or prevented, about the sea as the place where the gap between human will and natural reality is at its widest and its most consequential. The maritime tradition has always known this. The superstitions of sailors, the taboos and the rituals and the practices that struck landspeople as irrational, were responses to the reality of the gap, attempts to manage the relationship between intention and outcome in an environment where that relationship was unusually contingent. You did not whistle on a ship because whistling called the wind, and the wind was not always welcome. You did not carry a body on a ship because the dead were unlucky, and luck mattered in ways it did not on land. You did not rename a ship without performing the proper ceremonies because renaming disturbed the relationship between the vessel and the sea, and that relationship was not a metaphor but a practical reality. The Octavius, if she had been renamed before her final voyage, would have been sailing under the new name with the old relationship, or rather, no relationship, since the ceremony had not been performed. This may or may not be relevant. The story does not include a detail about renaming, but it illustrates the kind of thinking that the maritime tradition brought to the question of why ships were lost, a thinking that attributed outcomes to a web of relationship and obligation that was not visible but was nevertheless real. The crew of the Herald boarding the Octavius in 1775 were operating within this tradition. They knew what a ghost ship was, in the sense that they knew the stories and the superstitions. What they found was something that activated those stories, something that belonged to the category the stories had prepared them for, even though nothing had quite prepared them for this specific instance of it. How do you board a ghost ship? What do you look for, and what do you avoid touching? What do you take, and what do you leave? The practical decisions of the boarding party, to take the log, to leave the ship, were made within a framework of practical maritime necessity, but they were also made within a framework of cultural meaning that shaped what felt appropriate and what felt wrong. Taking the log was appropriate. The log was the official record of the voyage, the document that connected the ship to the world that had sent her out. Taking it was an act of recovery, of bringing back from the uncanny to the ordinary the thread of connection between the ship and her history. Leaving the ship and her dead was also appropriate. Moving bodies was complicated, practically and ritually. The dead were where they were, and the most respectful thing was to leave them there. The Herald's master, or whoever he was, made the decisions that felt right in the moment and then left the Octavius to continue her drift. He did not know that his decision to take the log would eventually produce the account that would eventually produce the story. He was simply doing what seemed appropriate in a situation that had no protocol. That is often how history is made. Not by grand decisions with full knowledge of their consequences, but by small practical choices in the moment, made by people who are simply trying to do the right thing without knowing what the right thing is or what it will become. Sleep is close now. Let the story carry you toward it the way the current carried the Octavius, without effort, without destination, simply moving through the dark water of the night toward wherever the morning will find you. The Arctic night has a quality of light that is entirely its own. In the polar winter, the sky is not simply dark. It is dark in a way that is different from the darkness of a cloudy night in southern latitudes, denser, somehow more complete, carrying the weight of all the light that is not there. But within that darkness, there is the aurora. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, is produced by the interaction of charged particles from the sun with the gases of the upper atmosphere. This is the scientific description, accurate as far as it goes, and adequate for explaining why the phenomenon exists. It says nothing about what it looks like from below. From below, the aurora is one of the most extraordinary sights available to a human eye. It moves, not like weather, which moves in the sense of blowing from one place to another, but in the sense of changing shape, of pulsing and flickering and sweeping across the sky in curtains and arcs and ribbons that seem to have an intention behind them, even though they have no intention at all. The colours range from the most common green, a cold, clear green that is unlike any green produced by photosynthesis, through pinks and purples and, in the most intense displays, a deep red that covers the entire sky like a stain. Sailors who saw the aurora for the first time were rarely indifferent to it. The accounts they wrote tend toward the reverent or the disturbed, depending on the temperament of the writer. The matter-of-fact prose that sailors use to describe weather and distance and cargo tends to loosen a little when the aurora enters the narrative. Something about it demands a different mode of expression. The crew of the Octavius, in those long Arctic winters, would have seen the aurora constantly. Every clear night, which in the Arctic winter is many nights, the lights would have been present. By the end of the first winter, they would have been accustomed to it in the way that you become accustomed to anything that is always there, noting it without the full attention that novelty brings perhaps, but still aware of it, still subject to the particular quality of feeling that it produces. What feeling does the aurora produce? This varies by temperament and expectation, but there is something common to many accounts, a feeling of smallness, of being in the presence of something that is operating at a scale, and by forces that have nothing to do with the human. The aurora is not hostile to humans, it is simply indifferent, in the way that stars are indifferent, in the way that deep water is indifferent, present, magnificent, requiring no response and producing none of its own. The northern lights are also associated in the traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic with the dead. The Inuit of different regions have different traditions about what the lights are and what they mean, but the association with the spirits of the dead, with the ancestors who have gone before, moving through the sky in some form that is both distant and close, is widespread enough to be noted as a common element in Arctic indigenous cosmology. There is something that the mind does with this association, given the context of the Octavius. The ship held its dead for 13 years, and above the ship, in the winters of those 13 years, the aurora performed its silent choreography. Whatever the lights mean, physically, culturally, or in the private language of each person who sees them, they were there, and the dead of the Octavius were there, and the connection is not merely circumstantial. It is the kind of connection that stories make naturally, that the image of the lights above the frozen ship produces without effort, without instruction. The Arctic night, for all its extremity, has a beauty that is not diminished by the cold. The stars seen from within the Arctic air, which is extraordinarily clear and free from the water vapour and particulate matter that dim stars in moister climates, are brilliant and numerous beyond what most skies show. The Milky Way, which modern light-polluted skies have made into a rumour for most people, is a definitive presence in the Arctic night, a river of light that spans the sky from horizon to horizon and shows, to anyone who attends to it, the actual character of the galaxy we inhabit. The crew of the Octavius, in the weeks before the cold took them, would have seen this sky, in the diminishing lamplight of the cabins below decks, in the cold that pressed through the hull, despite every effort to keep it out, they would have seen, when they looked up through a porthole or a hatch, the most extraordinary sky in the northern hemisphere. There is a tradition in certain Arctic survival accounts of the beauty of the place being noticed even by those who are suffering within it. The accounts of Franklin's men, pieced together from the records found in cairns on the islands where they died, mention the landscape. The journals of other Arctic explorers, written in conditions of extreme cold and hunger and isolation, note the quality of the light, the behaviour of the ice, the movement of the birds, with a care and attention that speaks to the human capacity for noticing beauty in situations that are not, by any ordinary standard, beautiful. This capacity is one of the more remarkable things about the human mind. Not the suffering which is predictable, but the continued ability to attend to what is outside the suffering, even while the suffering is going on. A man in the Arctic, slowly freezing, can still see the aurora, can still notice, if he looks up, the extraordinary depth of the winter sky. Whether the captain of the Octavius noticed these things, we do not know. His log, whatever it contained, might have mentioned the lights or might not. The log of a working captain is a professional document, and professional documents are not always the place where personal responses to the sublime find expression. The position, the weather, the state of the ship, the state of the crew, these are the expected contents of a captain's log. The aurora may or may not have been entered as a regular observation. But we can imagine that he saw it. We can imagine a man going above decks in the Arctic winter night, perhaps to check on the state of the ice, perhaps simply to breathe air that was not the trapped air of the below-deck space, and looking up and seeing the lights moving across the sky. We can imagine what that might have felt like in those circumstances, at that moment in the decline of the voyage. There is something in the image that is not entirely bleak. A man under a magnificent sky, in the middle of a disaster, looking up. Whatever he felt, he was not alone in the universe. The universe was fully present around him, in all its cold magnificence, attending to its own business, the business of light and magnetism and the charged particles of the solar wind, while he attended to his. Two businesses running in parallel in the same dark place, the universe doing what it does, a man doing what he does, neither aware of the other, both present. This is, in some form, the condition of every life. The universe operates at scales and by processes that the individual human cannot comprehend and does not need to. The individual human operates at scales and by processes that the universe does not attend to and does not require. The two run in parallel, in the same dark, and the fact of their coexistence is something that the Arctic, which removes everything else, makes very clear. Let that clarity come to you now, gently. You and the universe, in the same dark. The universe doing what it does, you doing what you do, which, right now, is resting, moving towards sleep, letting the story carry you a little further into the quiet. The aurora is still up there, above the clouds and the city lights in the ordinary night. It is always there, in one form or another, the lights moving across the high sky, doing what they do, indifferent to everything below, and beautiful in spite of that, or perhaps because of it. You do not need to see it tonight, you simply need to rest. Every story of a ship lost at sea is at some level a story about inheritance. Not inheritance in the legal sense, the wills and estates and the orderly transfer of property that the land world manages, but inheritance in the sense of what remains when someone is gone and what the remaining does to those who receive it. The Octavius, discovered in 1775, left behind a log. The log was taken. It presumably contained, in the handwriting of the captain, an account of the voyage from its beginning through its end, or rather, through November 1762, which was as far as the captain was able to carry it. What happened to that log afterward is part of the mystery. It has not been located in any archive. It may have been destroyed, or lost in a fire, or absorbed into a private collection that was never catalogued. It may conceivably still exist somewhere, in a box in an attic, its significance unrecognised, waiting for the scholar or the archivist who will eventually find it. If the log still exists, it contains information that no living person has. It contains the captain's account of the decision to turn north, of the first sight of the ice, of the entrapment and the winters and the decline of the crew. It contains, presumably, some record of the woman and the child, their names perhaps, their purpose aboard, what happened to them. It contains the entries that precede the last entry, the progression of hope and desperation and acceptance that the long entrapment would have produced. It contains, in the handwriting of a man dead since 1762, the voice of someone who went somewhere and did not come back. This is what we inherit from the lost, a voice in an old medium speaking from a distance in time that the medium bridges but does not eliminate. The handwriting carries the person in ways that print does not. The particular formation of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the places where the hand hesitated or hurried. Reading an old document is a peculiar experience that people who do it professionally sometimes describe in almost physical terms. The sense of contact with the person who wrote it, across whatever gap of time separates the writing from the reading. The captain's log, if found, would be that kind of contact. It would be the voice of a man who set out to find something and did not find it in the way he hoped, and who kept his record through the finding and the failing and the final November, and who was still writing when the cold made writing impossible. That voice, in the handwriting that carried it, would be extraordinarily present. We have lost that voice, or rather we have not yet found it. The distinction matters because finding is possible in a way that recovering from loss is not. The log may yet exist. The world is full of documents that have not been catalogued, papers in boxes in attics and basements and library storage facilities, manuscripts in collections that have never been systematically assessed. The history of discovery is full of documents that turned up unexpectedly in places no one thought to look. But even without the log, we have the story, and the story carries something of the voice, even at 2.5 centuries distance and filtered through the retellings of others. The essential character of the captain, the man who sat at his desk and kept writing, is in the story in a way that does not require the log to be present. The action speaks, as actions do, for itself. What do we make of a man who kept his professional obligations past the point where any profession remained to support them? Who maintained the form when the content had been stripped away? This is not a simple question. There is something that might be called admirable in it: the discipline, the consistency, the refusal to let the circumstances determine the behaviour. But there is also something that might be called tragic: the form maintained past the point of its meaning, the ritual enacted in the absence of the context that gave it significance. Perhaps the distinction does not matter, or matters less than it might appear to. Perhaps what the captain was doing in those final weeks of writing in his log was not primarily a professional act but a human one, the act of continuing to be himself in circumstances that were eliminating one by one the conditions that supported being himself. He wrote because he was the kind of person who writes. He kept the log because keeping the log was what he did. These are not separate acts from the man, they are the man. In this sense, the image of the captain at his desk is not tragic. It is simply the image of a person being entirely themselves at the moment the world ended. There are worse ways to be found. The woman in the cabin below is also a person being herself, the person who arranged blankets around a child, who tended a fire against the cold, who held her arms around the small body beside her. That is a person doing exactly what she would do, in any circumstances, because it is who she is. The cold that took her found her entirely in the act of being herself. We do not know her name. This matters less than it might, because the act is more lasting than the name. The name, if we had it, would be a convenience, a way of attaching the act to a specific person, making the person specific in the way that names make people specific. But the act exists without the name. It has its own specificity. A woman holding a child against the cold is not an anonymous act, even when the woman's name is not known. It is a precisely human act, as specific as any named action. The people of the Octavius, all of them, the captain and the crew and the woman and the child and whoever else was aboard, are people who went somewhere and did not come back, and whose going and not coming back became a story that has lasted 2.5 centuries. This is, in the arithmetic of historical persistence, an extraordinary outcome. Most people who died in the Arctic in the 18th century are not remembered. Most ships that were lost are not named. The Octavius is the exception, and the exception is produced by the image. The frozen ship, the captain at his desk, the image that concentrates meaning in a way that lasts. We inherit this image. We inherit the ship and the captain and the woman and the child and the 13-year drift. We inherit the mystery of the log and the question of what the passage looked like, and the particular quality of an Arctic night with the aurora overhead. We inherit all of it, not because we have legal title to it, but because we are the living in a world that the dead have left their traces in, and the traces call to us with a persistence that has nothing to do with blood or law. The dead leave their stories in the world, and the world carries them, and we are the world. This is what inheritance actually means in the larger sense. We carry what has been given to us, not always knowing we carry it, not always knowing what it is, but carrying it nevertheless. The Octavius is part of what we carry. She has been in the world for 2.5 centuries, drifting from one telling to the next, and she has reached you here, in this quiet hour, in whatever room you're in whatever year this is. She found you. That is what stories do. When they are stories worth finding, they find the people who need them. Rest now. The story has found you. You do not need to hold it. It will hold itself, the way ice holds what it has gathered, gently, completely, until the time comes to release. The night is long, you have time to drift. The search for the Northwest Passage did not end with the Octavius. It did not end with the Franklin expedition. It ended in one sense with Amundsen in 1906, and in another sense it has not ended yet. The passage that the Octavius may have drifted through is now navigable with modern technology in a way that it was not navigable in the 18th century. Ice-reinforced vessels, satellite navigation, weather forecasting of a precision that the 18th century could not imagine. These tools have made the passage a practical route in a way that no explorer of the earlier period could have made it, and climate change has retreated the Arctic ice to a degree that makes the passage more open in summer than it has been in any historically recorded period, which raises its own questions about what the future of the Arctic will be. But the obsession that drove the search for the passage, the desire for a shorter route, for a commercial advantage, for the prestige of having found something everyone wanted to find, is not a uniquely historical phenomenon. It is a form of a much older human impulse, the desire to connect what is separated, to bridge what is distant, to find the passage through. This impulse drives exploration not only of geographical spaces but of intellectual ones, the search for the explanation that connects two previously unrelated phenomena, the theory that provides the passage between what was known and what was not known before. The mariners who looked for the Northwest Passage were engaged in the same fundamental activity as the scientists who look for the explanation of dark matter, or the mathematicians who look for the proof of a conjecture that has been unproven for centuries. They were looking for the thing that, once found, would change the map, would make the world more navigable, more comprehensible, more connected. The difference is that the geographical passage was finite. It either existed or it did not, and once it was found, it was found. The intellectual passages tend to open onto other passages, so that every discovery reveals new unknowns, every bridge reveals new gaps. The world becomes more navigable and simultaneously more complex, a process that does not resolve into the kind of finality that Amundsen achieved when he emerged into the Pacific in 1906 and confirmed that the passage was real. Amundsen, after his Northwest Passage navigation, went on to other things. He was the first person to reach the South Pole in 1911. He led further Arctic expeditions. He died, at the age of 55, in a search and rescue mission over the Arctic Ocean in 1928, when the seaplane he was flying disappeared north of Norway. His body was never found. The Arctic, which he'd spent much of his life navigating, kept him. The man who'd done more than anyone to solve the riddle of the Northwest Passage ended in the same silence that the passage had kept for centuries. Gone, unmourned, but not unremembered, absorbed by the world that had been his subject. There is a pattern to this that seems significant, though it resists being stated too directly. The people who give their lives to understanding a particular kind of mystery tend, in some cases, to become part of the mystery themselves. The passage consumes its explorers, not always literally, but in the sense that the obsession that drove the exploration does not satisfy itself with a single finding. One passage opens into another. The explorer who finds the first must look for the second, and so on, until the looking itself becomes the life, and the life ends somewhere in the middle of the looking. This is not a tragedy, necessarily. It depends on what you think a life is for. If a life is for comfort and certainty and the accumulation of the known, then the explorer's life is a poor one. If a life is for the process of encountering the unknown, for the specific quality of experience that comes from being in a place or a situation that no one has been in before, or from understanding something that no one has understood before, then it is a rich one, regardless of how it ends. The captain of the Octavius had gone looking for something. He did not find it in the way he intended, but he had gone. He had turned the ship north when the easier choice was to turn south. He had entered the channels of the Arctic archipelago when the prudent choice was to avoid them. He had made the decisions that, in the end, cost him everything, and that, in the story's strange afterlife, produced something that has lasted long beyond him. The persistence of his story is a form of finding what he went looking for, even if it is not the form he would have chosen. He went looking for a passage and a profit, for something that could be brought back and converted into the ordinary currencies of the world he came from. What he found, what the cold preserved, and the years carried, and the Herald discovered, and Scoresby wrote about, and the centuries transmitted, is something that cannot be converted into ordinary currency, but has its own kind of value. He found, in the end, a story. Not a passage, but a story. Not a prophet, but an image. Not the thing he went looking for, but the thing that turned out to matter. The thing that the world, rather than the market, judged worth keeping. The market wrote the Octavius off as a loss in 1762 or 1763, whenever it was clear she was not returning. The world kept her. The world, which has longer memory than markets and different criteria for what is worth preserving, held onto the image of the ship and the captain and the pen and the log and the 13-year drift, and it has been passing the image along ever since. This is what the Octavius ultimately teaches. If a story about a lost ship can be said to teach anything, that the thing you find is not always the thing you are looking for, and that the thing you find may be more lasting than the thing you were looking for would have been. The passage, if the Octavius had found it and returned to port with the news, would have been commercially valuable for a few years, before other ships found it independently, and the advantage dissolved. The story has been valuable for 2.5 centuries and shows no sign of losing its power. The captain sat at his desk and kept writing. He did not know he was writing a story. He thought he was keeping a log. But the log became a story, the way all records become stories in the fullness of time, not by any act of intention, but by the simple fact that time passes and the record remains and the people who encounter it receive it as a story, with all that stories carry. You have received it now, you are carrying it. Not the log, that is still lost if it exists at all, but the story, which is the log's distillation, the essential pattern that the log was trying to record, and that the years have purified into something more concentrated and more clear than the original. The passage was real. The ship was real. The captain was real. The pen in his hand was real. The cold was absolutely, unambiguously real. And the story that all of it became is real too, in the way that stories are real, not in the way that ice is real, that cold is real, that the physical world is real, but in the way that meaning is real, in the way that resonance is real, in the way that a story told in the dark to someone who is listening, genuinely listening, is as real as anything. You have been listening. That is its own kind of real. Let it settle now. Let the story be what it is, complete in its way, ready to be carried into sleep and held there in whatever form sleep takes stories, and return to you in the morning as whatever you will remember, which will be enough. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And now let the story go. You have carried it long enough. It has done what it came to do, brought you here, to this quiet place, at the end of this quiet hour, where the night is all around you and the day is a long way away. The Octavius is still out there, somewhere in the deep account books of the past. The captain is still at his desk. The pen is still in his hand. The aurora is still moving above the ice, doing what it has always done, indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are not trying to be. You do not need to hold any of this. Let it drift. Let it go where the current takes it, out of your active attention and into the quieter places where the mind keeps what it keeps. Your body is heavy. Let it be heavy. There is nothing it needs to hold up against. The night is doing the holding. The dark is doing the cradling. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, in this moment, in this quiet. The ship is drifting. The ice is still. The stars are very far away and very bright, up above everything, above the clouds and the city and the noise of the world. They are doing what stars do. They have been doing it for a very long time, and they will continue without any help from you. You can rest. You can let everything go a little further, a little deeper. The breathing slows. The thoughts become less insistent. The story, which has been keeping you company, becomes the background rather than the foreground. Still present, but softened, the way music becomes background when the body's ready to sleep. The Octavius drifted for 13 years through the Arctic dark. Through 2 winters and 2 summers and all the ordinary days between, she went where the ice and the current took her. She was not in a hurry. She had nowhere she needed to be. She was simply moving slowly through the world, carrying what she carried until the Herald found her. You're moving slowly through the night. You are carrying what you carry, and the sleep that is coming, which is already close, which is already making itself felt in the heaviness of the eyes, and the loosening of the muscles, and the way the thoughts are becoming less structured and more like images. The sleep is the Herald coming to meet you. Let it come. There is nothing to do but let it come. The dark is soft. The cold of the story is far away. The ice is far away. The Arctic is far away. You are here, warm, held by the ordinary warmth of the world you inhabit, in the ordinary dark of the night you are in. Breathe, slowly. The way the ship moved, slowly, without effort, carried by forces that did not require your attention to operate. The story has ended, or it has not ended. Stories like this one do not end exactly. They simply pause and wait to be continued by whoever picks them up next, in whatever year, in whatever quiet place. But for you, tonight, it has arrived at its resting place. Rest there with it. Let the ship settle in the ice of your closing thoughts. Let the captain remain at his desk exactly as he was, pen in hand, the last line written. Let the aurora move above it all, as it has always moved, as it is moving now, green and quiet and vast. Sleep is here, sleep is exactly here. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.